Here's something nobody tells you when you first pick up your camera. You can know every single detail by heart and still take terrible photos. I spent years obsessing of whether my ISO was at 400 or 640, whether I should be shooting on aperture priority or full manual, whether my white balance was perfectly calibrated, and you know what happened? I missed the shot every single time. Because while I was buried in my camera menu, the moment disappeared. The light changed, the expression faded, and I was left with technically perfect settings for a photo that actually didn't exist. Today we're talking about the camera settings that actually move the needle on your creativity, and more importantly, the ones that are just noise. The ones that make you second guess yourself. The ones stealing your attention from what actually matters, the story you're trying to tell. I'm Cesar, balancing product management with photography. I know the struggle of finding time for creative work. In this channel, I share systems and workflows that actually work for busy professionals. So let's get one thing straight right now. Camera settings matter. Anyone who tells you that gear doesn't matter is either lying or shooting with a $40,000 Leica. But here's the thing that we need to talk about. Not all settings matter equally, and this is where perfectionists get absolutely destroyed. We treat every dial, every menu option, and every single parameter as if it's carrying equal weight. As if getting our picture style wrong is just as catastrophic as nailing focus, and it's not. And this false equivalence is what's killing our creativity. When humans face too many choices of equal perceived importance, we experience what's called decision paralysis. We freeze, we second guess. We spend more time deliberating than actually executing. And in photography, execution is kind of everything. A decent photo that actually exists, it's better than a photo that you missed because you were adjusting your color temperature. So here's what we're doing today. We're gonna break down the camera settings that actually impact your images in a meaningful way, the ones that change the story you're trying to tell. Then we're gonna go take a look at the settings that feel important but are actually just creative quicksand, the one that actually you can set and forget. And by the end of this video, you're gonna have a framework that lets you shoot in confidence instead of constantly questioning whether you made the right technical choice. Because, spoiler alert, the right technical choice is the one that actually gets you shooting instead of thinking. So let's get to point number one. The Holy Trinity, the only settings that actually change your story. And this is the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. But we're not gonna talk about them in the same way other tutorials do. We're not gonna memorize f-stops or shutter speed charts. Instead, we're gonna talk about what each actually does to the story you're trying to tell. Let's start with aperture. And aperture controls isolation. That's it. When you adjust your aperture, you're deciding how much of your frame is in focus versus how much actually falls away into blur. A wide aperture like f1.8 says this one thing matters and everything else is out of context. A narrow aperture like f11, for example, says the entire scene matters, take it all in. Neither is right or wrong. They are just narrative choices. When you're trying to shoot a portrait and you want the viewer's eyes locked on your subject expression, then you go wide. And when you're shooting a landscape where the foreground flower and the mountain in the distance both matter to the composition, you go narrow. This isn't technical perfectionism, this is storytelling. Then we have to talk about shutter speed, which controls motion and energy. A fast shutter speed freezes action. It could capture the precise moment a water droplet hits the surface. Slow shutter speeds, on the other hand, show movement. It turns waterfalls into silk and city streets into rivers of light. And here's what matters. Ask yourself if the motion in your scene is actually part of the story. If you're trying to shoot your kid's soccer game and you want to see the determination on their face as they kick, then you need a fast shutter speed because otherwise you're gonna get it blurred. On the other hand, if you're shooting a dancer and you want to show the flow and grace of the movement, a slow shutter speed might actually tell a better story. Again, this isn't about being technically perfect, it's about being narratively intentional. And the third one in the Holy Trinity is of course the ISO, which is your brightness backup. Here's the truth that gear snobs don't want you to hear. Modern cameras are absolutely good at ISO. If you've set your aperture for the depth of field you want, and you've set your shutter speed for the motion you want, and your image still too dark, then you should raise your ISO until it's bright enough. That's it. You're not ruining your image. You're making sure that the image actually exists in the first place. One thing I do and recommend, especially if you're just starting, is just set your ISO to automatic, but define a limit to how high it can go. And this is the basic framework: aperture for depth, shutter speed for motion, and ISO for brightness. Every other setting is secondary to these three. And even within these three, you're making creative decisions, not technical ones. Part 2 is the set it and forget it settings. And now let's talk about the settings that feel important but are actually just distractions dressed up as decisions. These are the ones that keep you in your camera menu instead of actually shooting. White balance is a big one here. Here's what perfectionists do. We spend 5 minutes in our menu trying to decide between 5200 Kelvin and 5600 Kelvin. We switch between daylight and cloudy presets, and we create custom white balance profiles. And then we get home and realize we shot everything in RAW, which means that we can change the white balance in post with literally zero quality loss. So here's the move. Set your white balance to auto white balance and forget it exists. If you're shooting RAW, then you'll fix it in editing. If you're shooting JPEG, which has its place for certain workflows, auto white balance in modern cameras is shockingly accurate. Either way, stop thinking about it. Picture styles and picture profiles are another trap. These are the settings with names like vivid, neutral, landscape, you know what I mean. They affect things like contrast, saturation, and sharpness. And here's the thing, if you're shooting RAW, they literally do not matter. They affect the preview you see on your camera's LCD screen, but they do not affect the actual RAW data being recorded. The RAW file contains all the information regardless of what picture profile you've selected, so you're gonna make these decisions in post anyway, where you have infinitely more control and can actually see what you're doing on a proper monitor. So set it to standard or neutral and move on with your life. Next up, we have focus modes, which deserve a mention here because this is where people get obsessive. Single shot autofocus versus continuous autofocus versus manual shot autofocus. And here's the simple framework. If your subject is not moving, use single shot. If your subject is moving, use continuous. If you're shooting video or you're working in conditions where autofocus struggles, use manual. That's it. You don't need to understand every autofocus algorithm your camera offers. You don't need to customize autofocus point behaviors. Pick the mode that matches whether your subject is stationary or moving and let the camera do its job. Modern autofocus is absurdly good, so trust it. And let me be clear about something. I'm not saying that these settings are irrelevant. I'm saying that they are not worth your mental energy during the shoot. Make the decision once, set them up in a way that works for your general workflow, and then stop revising this decision every single time you pick up your camera. And point number 3 is the perfectionist trap. Why more control actually limits creativity. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that we need to address. The reason we obsess over every camera setting is not because we need that level of control. It's because adjusting settings feels productive. It feels like we're being professional, like we're being thorough. But there's a massive difference between being thorough and being stuck. On the research about the paradox of choice, it was found that when people have too many options, they become less satisfied with the actual final decision, even when that decision was objectively good. They actually spend more time wondering if they made the right choice and less time enjoying the actual outcome. So in photography, this manifests as spending more time in your camera menu than actually observing light, anticipating moments, or connecting with your subject. I, by the way, gave some tips on how to shoot in certain situations, especially if you're a shy street photographer in the video over here. Check it out if you're interested. And I want to share something that changed my entire approach. There's a concept used in product management called the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle. It states that roughly 80% of the outcomes come from 20% of inputs. When we apply this to camera settings, it's transformative. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO represent about 20% of your camera setting, but they account for roughly 80% of your camera's creative impact. Everything else, all those menu options and fine-tuning parameters, they're just contributing to the remaining 20% of the impact. And yet, if you're like most perfectionists, then you're probably spending 80% of your mental energy on that 20% of impact. Crazy. So here's what matters when you let go of perfectionism around settings. You start seeing again. You notice light, you anticipate expressions, you find compositions because your brain isn't occupied in whether your metering mode should be evaluative or spot metering. You freed up that processing power for the things that actually make photos interesting. As an example, some photographers actually shoot exclusively with one camera, one lens, and the same settings for everything. That's it, no decisions. This is actually one of the reasons I love shooting with the Ricoh GR3, especially when I test out film simulations, because then I just focus on the shooting and what's going on around me. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go to that extreme, but the principle matters. Constraints breed creativity, and when you remove the infinite possibility of perfect settings, you're forced to work with what you have. And that's when interesting thing happens. And now let's go to the next point, which is building your own personal settings framework. So how do we actually implement this? How do we move from perfectionism to intentionality? First, you need to identify your default starting point. This is a set of settings that work for 80% of what you shoot. For me, it's aperture priority mode, f4, auto ISO with a maximum of 6400, auto white balance, and continuous autofocus. When I pick up my camera, that's where it lives. I'm not starting from zero every time. In fact, I save that as a custom mode that I always go back to. I'm starting from that baseline that I know works, and then I adjust the settings that matter for the specific story I'm trying to tell. Second, you have to practice the 3-second rule. Before you change any settings, pause for 3 seconds and ask yourself, will changing this setting meaningfully change the story I'm trying to tell? If the answer is no, well, don't touch it. If you can articulate why a settings change matter, it probably doesn't. This simple pause breaks the compulsive adjustment cycle that perfectionists fall into. Third, embrace shooting modes intelligently. There's this weird stigma about aperture priority or shutter priority modes, like real photographers only shoot manual. That's nonsense. Aperture priority mode means you control the aperture and the camera handles the shutter speed. If depth of field is what matters to your story, then that's the perfect tool. Shutter priority mode, on the other hand, means that you control the shutter speed and the camera handles the rest. If motion is what matters to you, then use that. Manual mode is great when lighting is consistent and you also want full control, but it's not inherently more professional. It's just another tool. Use the tool that lets you focus on the creative decision that matters most for your shot. So here's a quick question for all of you. What camera settings do you obsess with the most? The one that you find yourself adjusting constantly even though it probably doesn't matter as much as you think? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious if there's a pattern there, and I'll respond to as many as I can with whether it's worth your energy or not. So let's bring it home. The camera settings that actually matter are the ones that change the story you're telling. Aperture controls how much is in focus, shutter speed controls the motion, ISO controls brightness. Everything else is a one-time decision that you make when you're setting up your camera, or it's something you handle better in post-production anyway. And the goal is not to become less technical, it's to become more intentional. To recognize that perfectionism in camera settings isn't the same as excellence in photography. Excellence comes from observation, timing, composition, and connection with your subject. Camera settings are just the tools that help you capture what you already seen and felt. They are not the end, they are the means. If you're someone who's been stuck in this camera settings trap, paralyzed by options, second-guessing every adjustment, give yourself permission to let go. Set up your camera with a solid baseline. Learn the 3 settings that actually change your story and then go shoot. Miss some shots, get some shots. That's how you learn what actually matters versus what's noise. If this resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who want to create more and overthink less. And if you found this helpful, leave a like so I know to make more content like this. I'll see you in the next one.